Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Lots of people still joining, so we'll just wait a moment to let a few more people join the meeting. But lovely to have you all with us this morning. Morning, those just joining. Thank you for coming. We're just letting a few more people into the meeting before we start. Okay, it's 2 minutes past 10, so I will make a start. Good morning, everyone, and on behalf of ICOM UK, welcome and thank you for joining us this morning for this webinar on Museum Bridge, where we'll be sharing the findings of our recent research on a model for connecting museums internationally. We're thrilled by the response to the research and this webinar, and at the moment, we're delighted to have around 35 people in the room with us, although we have had more than 140 register. So I'm hoping more will be joining all the time. My name is Christina Broughton, and I am Strategic Director of ICOM UK, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. My visual description, I'm a middle-aged white woman with platinum blonde shoulder-length hair, and today I'm wearing a light pink blouse and thick-rimmed tortoiseshell glasses. I'm joined here with my colleague Anne Hipperson today, who will be assisting with the technical aspects of the webinar in the background. And before I introduce our speakers and we get underway, just a little bit of housekeeping. So as attendees, your microphones and cameras have been disabled for this webinar. However, the chat and Q&A functions are enabled for everyone. Please use the Q&A for any questions that you have for our speakers during the webinar, and the panel will aim to respond to as many questions as we can and as time will allow during the webinar. There'll be two Q&A sessions this morning, one in about 25 minutes time and a second Q&A towards the end of the webinar. Please use the chat function if you're having any technical difficulties. Anne will be monitoring the chat throughout the webinar, so she'll do her best to respond to you there. And you can also use the chat function to reach out to other attendees during the webinar this morning. This webinar is being recorded and transcribed, and all registered attendees will receive a notification with a link to the recording and the transcript as soon as they are available. A recording will also be made available on ICOM UK's YouTube channel with a link available on the Museum Bridge information page on our website. We encourage you to share the recording with any colleagues or contacts that you have that you think might be interested in this research and were unable to attend the meeting this morning. On the same webpage on our website, you'll find a link to the Museum Bridge research report and a feedback form. We are keen to hear your feedback as it will help us inform how we shape and take the project forward into the next stage. So I do encourage you all to spend some time reading the report if you haven't already, reflecting on this webinar, and then taking a moment just to complete that feedback form for us. So brief introduction before I introduce our speakers. In 2025, ICOM UK, in partnership with the British Council, commissioned research to explore the drivers for international museum collaboration, and specifically what the UK museum sector needed to build better, stronger, more equitable and effective connections with colleagues in museums and around the world. The consultancy City Global Futures were selected through an open tender process to undertake this research, which they did between May and November 2025, with the final report delivered in December 2025. Following a period of internal digestion and consideration, both ICOM UK and the British Council were pleased to launch Museum Bridge publicly in conjunction with ICOM UK's annual conference in April this year. Maybe some of you were there, and we had a workshop as well. Today's webinar is part of our ongoing dissemination of the research findings, which will be continuing throughout the summer. And as I mentioned earlier, this is also a period during which we hope to gather more feedback on the research, which will help to inform the next steps for Museum Bridge. So without further ado, it is now my pleasure to welcome Stephen Hilton and Kate Arthurs from City Global Futures, who led the research and will be sharing the findings here with you today. So welcome, Stephen and Kate.
Thank you. Thank you, Christina. And thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm Kate Arthurs. I'm here with Stephen Hilton. I'm a white woman in my 40s, and today I'm wearing a red and white dress. So as Christina said, this project was commissioned by ICOM UK and the British Council to explore how international museum collaboration is evolving and how it could become more accessible, more equitable and sustainable in the future. So Stephen and I will share some of the key research findings, and then we'll introduce an emerging model that we're calling Museum Bridge. So Stephen, over to you.
Thank you. If we can move to the next slide.
Slide. Yes.
Yeah, great. So it's great to be here today. I'm Stephen Hilton. I'm a middle-aged white man with silver grey hair, and today I'm wearing a bottle green or olive green suit jacket and a white shirt. So let me first of all just take you through how we are planning to present the research to you. First of all, we'll explain a bit more about the research and what we were aiming to find out. We'll talk about the approach that we followed and who took part. And then we will run through some of the headline findings, looking at things like the motivations and barriers that museums told us they face when it comes to international collaboration. And we'll also look at what organisations said they would like in order to help their partnerships become more effective. And then Kate, I'll hand over to Kate, who will talk through the evolving Museum Bridge model. As Christina said, there will be 2 Q&As. We'll pause after I present the research findings. So if people have any questions about the research or would like any clarifications on the approach, we'll take those then. And then after Kate's presented the Museum Bridge model, we'll be joined by the research commissioners and answer more broad questions at that point. So next slide, please. So Kate brings to the research a great deal of experience of working in the creative and cultural sector and building international collaboration. My own background is in civic and regional strategy, particularly around systems and cross-sector partnerships, and in research. We worked together through the consultancy City Global Futures, which was formed 10 years ago, and through the consultancy we tend to work on projects that focus on cultural and civic issues where networks and collaboration are important. So next slide, please. So why now? Well, I guess it's clear that the world is an increasingly complex place, and the issues that museums are dealing with are part of that complexity. Often museums are addressing questions around restitution, the climate, and at the same time dealing with rising costs, limited budgets, and of course, when it comes to international work, pressures on things like travel costs. There's also a sense that access to arts and culture is recognised increasingly as being important, and there are inequalities around that access that museums are often at the forefront of trying to tackle. One of the things that we really heard as part of the research is that whilst there is a lot of excellent international collaboration going on, the system isn't working for all equally at the moment. And whilst there is an appetite for international collaboration, it's not always the case that institutions are able to fulfill that easily at the moment. So let's move on to the next slide. So the research had 4 objectives. The first was to really understand the current landscape, what's working around international collaboration and engagement. The second was to identify the barriers, but also the enablers of good collaboration. We were keen to explore how existing networks, in particular the networks of our commissioners, British Council and ICOM, and how they could be utilised to support more effective international collaboration. And then lastly, we wanted to go beyond just providing research findings by working with the commissioners to create a practical and scalable model that could be used to encourage and build more effective collaboration. Next slide, please. So over the 6-month research period, we undertook different forms of qualitative and quantitative research. We started with interviews, both with UK and international museums representatives. Through that process, we built a survey to start to dig a little bit deeper into some of the issues that we'd heard and to understand what some of the opportunities might be. We used that survey to start to develop a model, and we tested that through international workshops. And of course, at the same time, we looked at existing research and policy in order to ensure that we could learn from existing knowledge. We were keen to engage a broad group of perspectives from organisations, not only in the UK, but internationally. We wanted to engage both with those who are already actively involved in international collaboration, but also those who perhaps have more limited involvement at the moment. And the next slide shows who we were able to reach. There's well over 100 participants through the research as a whole from multiple countries. For example, the workshops that we did towards the end of the research projects, I think 8 countries were represented in those workshops. We had 82 survey respondents. And as you can see on the slide, we were pleased that the response came fairly equally from UK and international representatives. We heard from national, regional and local museums, including independent museums and those that are linked to universities. Importantly, as I said, there was also a good balance between those who are actively involved and those who want to do more international research. So let me take you on to some of the headline findings. Perhaps move to the next slide, thank you. So I'll go into these in a little bit more detail, but to give you a flavour of what we heard overall, it's clear through all of the research that we did that the appetite for collaboration is strong, but the capacity to enact that collaboration or that ambition is often a bottleneck. People are interested in international work as a channel for learning and exchange and building long-term relationships. But access remains unequal, especially for smaller museums and institutions. What we heard is that in order to move forward, people would really welcome clearer pathways to engage in international activity. There was a strong desire for practical tools like case studies and business cases, and a recognition that having an advocate or a trusted intermediary could really help to unlock some of the barriers that people are facing. So let's look in a little bit more detail at some of the findings. If we go to the next slide. We asked about motivations and barriers that institutions faced. The strongest motivation that people told us they had was around professional learning and knowledge exchange. And this is interesting because whilst reputation and prestige are often associated with international collaboration, I think what we learned is that this is genuinely about people wanting to learn from each other, and there's a strong sense of reciprocity within that. The biggest barriers, perhaps no surprise, are funding, staff capacity, but also legislative or political constraints. So the big challenge is often not about willingness to collaborate. It's about the infrastructure that's available to support the collaboration. Next slide, please. So we tested through the research, we tested a number of ways that collaboration can be supported. We asked about signposting, but also about brokerage and capacity building. So not simply providing information and expecting people to find their own way through it, but also about more actively curating and building partnerships. What we discovered is that the interest was very high across all three of those ways of working. And at the same time, respondents to the research really wanted those to be integrated in a holistic way, rather than being seen as individual or separate services. Next slide, please. There's just a quote here that's drawn from one of our interviews. It really highlights the value of face-to-face meeting in building long-term relationships. We explored through the research the value of digital tools and platforms, and there is a great deal of value there, but we also heard very strongly that trust is built through meeting people face-to-face. So we don't feel that digital platforms can replace that. Next slide, please. One of the interesting things that we explored through the research was how institutions felt they may be willing to contribute to this type of sector-wide work. And it was encouraging that most said that they would be willing to contribute either financially or through resources such as hosting or providing staff expertise. The strong sense that comes from this finding is that people feel that this is something that can be co-owned and co-delivered, and it's in that sense a real shared endeavour that people felt they could engage with around increasing collaboration as a whole. Next slide, please. We also heard that museums increasingly want their international work to align with their vision and values. Questions around ethics, reciprocity, sustainability, and mutual benefit were at the heart of people's thinking when it came to talking about their desire for increased international collaboration. Next slide, please. We explored the sorts of themes that people would like to pursue through international collaboration, and some of them are listed here. Decolonialization and restitution, conservation and environment and sustainable practice were amongst the top themes that people regularly identified. There was also a strong preference for open and inclusive collaboration, rather than something that is targeted only to a small number of organisations. Next slide, please. We explored through the research a number of different case studies, and you would be able to find those in the research reports. There are a couple on the slide here. I mean, what we recognise through the research is that the examples of international collaboration vary enormously in the scale and the geography and the focus, but there are a number of underlying considerations that appear to be quite common. The idea that the effective work is really about long-term trust. It's about both partners or all partners seeing benefit, so reciprocity and mutual learning. And it's about a sense of sort of governance and control, where all partners feel that they have some degree of shared authority over the project. Okay, so next slide, please. We'll go on in after the, I'll pause for a Q&A in a second, and Kate will go on to talk about the Museum Bridge model, but just to make a link, I guess the sort of strategic implications that we took from the research is that in order to build more effective, sustainable and inclusive international collaboration, it is about building capacity. It's also about deepening partnerships and relationships that already exist. Clearly, it's about aligning the resources that there are to support this work. And it's about keeping systems open and inclusive. Next slide, please. So we'll pause for any questions about the research that either Kate or I might be able to answer. And then we'll go on to talk about the model that we created based on the research.
Thank you, Stephen and Kate. So as we said, we're going to pause here for some Q&A. So if you do have any questions about the research methodology and approach, please do add them to the Q&A. And whilst you're doing that, I'll just kick us off, Stephen and Kate. I just wondered, what were some of the limitations that you faced in terms of either the methodology or the participants you were able to gather around the research, and how could this be built upon in the next stages?
I think one thing I would highlight is that, so we had, towards the end of the research, we held some really good workshops to explore findings in more depth. And they revealed for us something of the challenges of international collaboration itself. So I think, as Stephen mentioned, we had really good balanced participation between UK and international people taking part in those workshops. But in many cases, people were trying to join us from countries where there is perhaps a poor internet connection, or there are other disruptions taking place in their daily work life that meant that actively taking part was much more difficult for some people than for others. And that reveals a wider challenge around the operating context that museum professionals are working in the UK compared with a very wide range of countries internationally. And those disparities need to be factored into both programme design and then the kind of operational reality of how museums engage with each other. I'm sure that will be really familiar to many of the colleagues who are joining the call today.
Thank you, Kate. I think I would add that on reflection, it's also important to recognise that within museums there is an ecosystem of people who have all sorts of different roles. So we were successful in talking to museum directors and some funders, and we did engage with some collections and curatorial staff. Perhaps we engaged less with people who are focused on things like international exhibitions or touring exhibitions. Maybe we could engage more with people who bring a more commercially minded focus to international collaboration, who look at it through a business and a commercial lens, as well as those who see it as being part of their core mission and vision. So I guess, people on this webinar will recognise that when we talk about museums, that actually encompasses people with all sorts of different skill sets and priorities.
And I think that in some ways is perhaps reflected in those key themes that emerged, is that, the limitation around what roles people were in. Those themes might expand, I guess, in the next stage. Okay, thank you. So I have no questions in the Q&A. So I don't know if people are still asleep this morning or just warming up. Is there anything else you'd like to add at this point, or shall we move into the next part of the presentation?
Only to encourage people to look at the research reports. Clearly, we've given a brief overview. Within the reports, there's quite a lot of depth. We were able to contrast and explore some differences between UK and international museums. We were able to look at some differences between different institution types. I've not gone into that level of detail here, but there is more depth there if people are interested.
Well, as you were talking, I now have 3 questions. So let's take these. You mentioned ethical considerations. Are you able to share any insights?
I think the one that I would perhaps, well, 2 that I would draw out actually. One is about equity of participation, and this really does connect to the point that I raised previously. There's something about the design, the shaping, and then the delivery of a programme of work that is international, is led by the UK, but there is a really strong ethical appetite from museum professionals everywhere for that to be initiated on a truly equitable basis. And I think that's a recognition of how museums and the thinking in museums and the ethical practice in museums is changing. And so the sort of equitable nature of programme design is really at the forefront of a lot of people's minds. The other area that I would highlight, and so Stephen mentioned that sustainability is an important element of the content of the work that people are interested in exploring together. But there are challenges, as you will all be aware, of the sustainability of international collaboration. It involves moving people around, and in order to provide that face-to-face trust building that Stephen talked about, people do need to get on planes. Objects need to be moved around the world if we're talking about sharing it through collections. And there are very strong sustainability considerations that come into play with that as well. So those are 2 of the ethical dimensions I would highlight.
Thank you. Okay, another question here. Did you speak to any community engagement staff in the research?
That's a good question.
We heard examples of community engagement, both from the UK and internationally. So people gave us case studies and examples of where engaging with their local sort of diaspora communities had been a strong driver for the way that they'd focused and prioritised their international work. I'm thinking, for example, of work that Manchester did with Australian sort of First Nations people, and thinking of some of the work around sort of Asia and UK institutions. We did also speak with a number of British Council international sort of regional representatives, and whilst they're not working at a sort of grassroots community level, it really struck me that their role is around working with the community across a very large geographical area. So I guess we thought about community at different levels, possibly.
I think that's right.
Yeah, I think it goes back to your response to my initial question about how, we could deepen the research and engagement by talking to different sorts of colleagues across the museums in the next stages. So yeah, thank you for that.
It would also be nice to talk to some of the communities directly. We have stories of value, but it would be nice to hear some of those directly from communities that have worked with their local museums.
Great, thank you. Okay, another question here. Were you able to identify any differences in openness to international cooperation depending on the type of museum, for example, art museum, history museum, etc.?
Well, I think the first thing I would say, and then Stephen, you can add to this, is that content-led collaboration is really central. So it's really vital for museums to be able to find and develop relationships with partners where they have something in common. A thematic collection-based interest is a really strong grounding for the development of a partnership. I realise I haven't gone into detail about the specific level of interest in the way that the question asked, but that was certainly something that we found.
Building on that, I mean, some of our research participants were just so clear that international collaboration is hardwired into their vision and purpose. Often those were national institutions, or they were research-based, so collaborations with the universities. At a local level, we spoke also to sort of smaller institutions, maybe operating at city or a smaller regional level. They did often face barriers in securing approval for international collaboration at a time when budgets are particularly tight at local level. Gaining permission to engage internationally, even where there was a strong rationale and desire, was something that they had to navigate quite carefully with varying degrees of success. And therefore, that plea for case studies, business cases, evidence that international collaboration can bring benefits across lots of different domains was very genuine. People felt that they needed that in order to be able to overcome some of those questions about, well, why should we do this?
Brilliant. Okay, so I'm saying I have no further questions in the Q&A. I think I might have a slight delay, so do get your questions in early so that they are sure to come through. But I think we might be able to move on, Stephen and Kate. And there will be another Q&A at the end of the webinar, so do save anything up for then, and you know, pop them in the Q&A between now and then, please. Okay, I'm going to reshare your presentation.
Thank you, Christina. So I'd now like to introduce Museum Bridge. Museum Bridge is designed as a shared support model, and at its core, it aims to inform, facilitate, and empower. The idea of Museum Bridge is to create connective infrastructure that helps museums to engage internationally more easily and more equitably. If we could move to the next slide, please. There are two pathways. So one of the key insights from the research was that organisations are at very different stages. So the model includes two pathways: build, which is for those who are starting out, and deepen, which is for organisations wanting to expand their existing relationships. Moving on to the next slide, I'll now talk about the core functions of Museum Bridge. So the proposed functions include a range of interventions and support: partner matching, thematic collaboration, exchanges, coordination, communications, and advocacy. The overall aim of this package of support is to enable collaboration as an ongoing ecosystem rather than just as a one-off intervention. Moving on to the next slide. Capacity and equity are absolutely key. So this part of the model focuses specifically on widening participation. And that includes practical guidance, shared learning, bursaries and translation support, and co-creation approaches. The goal of all of these together is to reduce barriers and broaden access. moving on to the next slide, what next? Well, all the partners see this as a practical and scalable model that's ready for further testing and iterative development. So the next step is broader engagement with partners across the museum and cultural sector. Ultimately, this is about building a stronger and more resilient international collaboration ecosystem for museums. I haven't gone into great detail about the package of support that is being proposed here, so I think we can delve into that further as we take questions. If we just move on to the next slide, please do keep in touch with us if you'd like to continue this conversation or explore other future collaboration opportunities. Mine and Stephen's details are on this slide. But if we move on to the next slide, I'll hand back to Christina to both introduce the other commissioners, and we all welcome your comments for further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate and Stephen. So we now have a pause again for our second Q&A session in this webinar. I'm just going to take the slides off the screen so we can see people better. There we are. And as before, I invite you to type your questions into the Q&A function. And please, whilst you do so, and it's my pleasure to welcome the commissioners of the Museum Bridge Research, co-chair of ICOM UK, Dr. Christian Bars, and Stephen Stenning, who is Director of Culture and Action from the British Council, who will be joining us now to answer your questions about Museum Bridge, the research, the findings, the next steps, anything that is of interest to you. And to kick off the conversation, I might just turn to Christian and Stephen and ask, what led you to commission this piece of research from the perspective of ICOM UK and the British Council? And where are you hoping it will go in the next stage? Christian, you want to start?
Thanks very much, Christina, and thanks also to Kate and Stephen for the presentation here today. It's a really, really important piece of work for ICOM UK, and the conversations about this had really started a couple of years ago when we were actually working with Kate, or Kate was working for ICOM UK at the time, and we were starting to think about a strategy for ICOM UK that encompassed all sorts of things. And the notion of connecting museums internationally and removing some barriers that are clearly there kind of, was in its roots then at the time, and really sort of last year then the conversations with the British Council, who we've been working with together for a long time already as a really, really trusted partner. And I think, that came through in the presentation earlier as well. A lot of this is about trusted relationships. And if you're trying to work out who you can work with and you have relatively little knowledge or perhaps no knowledge at all about the other culture, about people, there are an awful lot of questions to answer where trust is really important. And working out, okay, who can introduce you actually to people and facilitate conversations. We'll leave perhaps examples for another part of the discussion or for later. But it's a service, and I'm delighted. Thank you to the question from Kathleen here as well, who works for an agency that is based in Germany that already facilitates this sort of service. We don't necessarily want to copy that and emulate that, but it is interesting to note that we're not the only ones who are realizing there is a gap in the market, so to speak, and there is plenty of room to develop models on this equitable and sustainable basis as well.
Thanks. Steve?
Thank you. Hello, everybody. So, yeah, my name's Stephen Stenning, as it said, audio description. I'm white male in my 60s, so I don't think I can claim middle age anymore. Greying, and I'm wearing a dark blue high-necked top. And I'm just realizing that I'm unshaven and slightly scruffy. Sorry about that. And my background suggests that my visual background suggests that I'm on an island off the Outer Hebrides. I'm not, but I am in Scotland and I am in Dundee. As to the question, so for British Council, and I won't assume you all know, so British Council is the UK's cultural relations agency. That was formed in the 30s with a mission to build trust and understanding with nations across the world. So we have offices in about 100 countries. Often, museums, has been a connection between museums has been a consistent form of bilateral connection and certainly huge interest in developing that. We as an organization haven't historically had a sort of a museums focus. We have in arts and various art forms, but not museums. And then, some 10 years ago, while I was all based in the Middle East, North Africa, we got involved in a cultural protection fund. And one of the results of that is you see just how important heritage museums are to dialogue and dialogue between countries at the moment. So that was a lot of the motivation to ask for this, to commission this piece of research. And I think that sort of role that museums are playing in addressing some of the questions that have been highlighted in the report was quite a revelation to me, my background being in theatre and writing and festivals. And I think with a bit of the question that was about where do we hope to go with it, I think for British Council, we recognise that we want to be more consistent and be able to provide a way of encouraging that dialogue that is supportive into the future and builds equitable and sustainable relationships, as has been said a number of times.
Thank you. So I guess I'm hoping for some more questions in the Q&A, but I guess the natural follow-on is, what do you see as the biggest challenges in developing Museum Bridge from here? Particularly for colleagues and organisations, well, both in the UK and abroad. I don't know, Steve, do you want to kick off with that one?
I was hoping you were going to kick off with Christian, but okay.
I'll give you more thinking time. Sorry. Oh, Steve, you've gone mute on us.
Sorry about that. How's that?
Yeah.
Yes. So there are a number of ways of looking at that question. I mean, there are very obvious challenges. I mean, there are challenges that point that has been made about the importance of consistency, about the importance of finding ways that allows different organizations to connect in different ways. That requires a good deal of financial support and resources. It requires a certain assurance that you're going to have those financial support and those resources into the future. So that is obviously a challenge. I think also there are those challenges for us of as an organization that works internationally, then there's a sort of ever-changing picture that countries are in focus. Countries are the focus of attention, and therefore at any one time it's easier to get support, it's easier to connect. Then that changes surprisingly quickly. So again, that's a sort of point about consistency. And then, I guess there are, big challenges, and Kate sort of earlier referred to these, about the inbuilt imbalances that there are, and within the UK, and definitely when working from the UK with other countries, and some big questions that dominate those collaborations when they get underway, that have sort of different resonances in different places. So particularly when looking at decolonialization, when looking at issues of restitution, then there's a sort of pilot we're looking at the moment, and one of the things that reveals is the very different constraints and implications there are in different countries.
If I may add to that, and apologies, I jumped straight past the introduction earlier. So I'm a white male as well, and I'm in age. I'm not far behind Steve, but I'm still firmly claiming middle age. And I'm wearing a green jumper and a white shirt and glasses, and sporting a trendy little beard. In challenges, I agree with Steve, and all of us know that resourcing in the cultural sector is always tricky, and that's got to be top of the list, the financial side of things. There is another element for me though as well, and that is the being seen, being perceived to be independent and credible as an organization, service, whatever this is going to be. And this is coming from the background that we know, not just from the NEMO, from the regular NEMO reports about political interference in museums across Europe and the rest of the world. There is an awful lot of political influence seeking in the museum sector all around the world. And if you're trying to build trust, so I think for me, one of the issues would be that if such a service was seen to be heavily influenced, rightly or wrongly, by government, then that would be a barrier to trusting relationships. So, and I'm not talking, it could be that we're trying to build this up as independent as possible. But the experience of potential partners, their own lived experience of political interference might make them suspicious. So I think one of the challenges for Museum Bridge going forward is to make it clear from the outset that this is an independent service, that it's not an arm of the British government, and be very open about this, that we're not representing a government position, but truly working for communities and to connect museum to museum. So for me, that is both a question of where the funding for something like this comes from, and it's also, and perhaps more importantly, a question of communication, of making sure that there is an understanding of what the service is actually trying to achieve, and that is, it is not trying to achieve political aims, but to support communities.
Right, thank you very much. I've got quite a good follow-on question here.
Christine,
yes.
I'm really sorry, but may I just sort of jump in? Please and build on, before you come to the follow-on question, the point that Steve raised about longevity of relationships and the trust building around that. So one of the things that we heard from the research was that so decolonisation is genuinely a really central topic for museums in the UK and internationally, and the appetite to engage on that theme is very wholehearted. The duration of relationships that are required to do that in a serious and meaningful way is really long. So it can take a very long time to build the basis of trust that on which even a dialogue can then begin. One of the people we talked to spoke of a 7-year relationship in place before they could even begin to think about the possibility of exchange of objects. So I think that kind of really long-term relationship is the basis for trust. That is one of the challenges of taking forward Museum Bridge. Sorry to interrupt.
No, thank you. I think that's a really important adage, and actually it still fits nicely with this follow-on question. And actually, Kate and Stephen, I might ask you to respond to this one first. I'll read it out. We've touched on some of this in the last response, but the question says, I'm curious about your insights into equitable partnerships. Is equity truly possible between UK-based museums where we come from a relatively privileged position and partners in the Global South, global majority? What qualities should UK-based organisations aim to embody to move towards equity? So I just wonder if there was anything that came through the findings or when you were talking to people from the global majority about this research, about what they were hoping to see from UK-based organisations. And then I'll give a chance for Christian and Steve to respond as well.
Okay.
Do you want me to start?
Yeah, you start.
I think there are two things that I would begin with. One is quite specific, and the other is more of a kind of behavioural stance. So the specific proposal that was made was actually about the governance of Museum Bridge. And the proposal was to make sure from a very early stage that the steering of the programme as it's developed is undertaken by a balanced group that includes representation from the Global South. And that is a form of acknowledging an inbuilt power imbalance that exists in decision making and potentially in resources as well. So that has come through in the recommendations that we've made through this research. The other area is more, as I said, it's a more behavioural stance. So it is really about UK, or I would say more generally Global North partners, recognising and acknowledging a privileging of resources that can come with being located in a financially wealthier country or a former colonising country, and to begin by acknowledging that. And once the acknowledgement is there, then a dialogue can be had about the consequences of that and what can be done to work with that, and so that it's present and it's not something that we pretend isn't there or is sidelined, but the way of working with that will be quite context specific, because that's the nature of international relationships. Is there anything you want to add to that, Stephen?
I think that's a really good reflection on the sort of big picture that we heard. I guess all I would add is I was really struck when we ran the workshops towards the end of the research, where we had both UK and international representatives in a conversation together. That real sense that came through to me was one of urgency. People felt that there was a real imperative around forming these sorts of relationships, and that in some instances people were desperate to learn practice around maintaining collections, around understanding how best to sort of broker in a really practical way international connections. I think the barriers that are often faced, as Kate said, there's a sort of sense in which we might take for granted our ability to overcome some of those, but I think there was a real sense of please give us some tools and advice and help, and listen to us at the same time, and then we can be more equal in terms of the relationships that we form.
Thank you. Christian?
Yeah, the question is not that I want to distort Maria's question, but it's there's probably something in there about no longer reproducing structural inequity. You know, inequities are there, and I would entirely agree that we need to be open about our awareness of these. But there is certainly an intention to no longer reproduce these. Having said that, good intentions can still reproduce existing structures. So there is perhaps, you know, more than awareness necessary as well from our side, and in particular, actually, incredible cultural literacy, which is actually so in both in providing the service, but also by the service providers themselves, and being upfront and open about this to essentially indicates there is humility from our side. We know that structurally, historically, there've been an awful lot of wrongs. Now we're trying to move forward in a direction that is much more positive, and if not neutral, then at least as equitable as we can, and seeking to make these constant improvements.
Thank you. Steve, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, it's such an important question, I think, for us and for all the work that we do. And I agree entirely about that. Seeking to, you know, being open about the imbalances and the inequalities, and seeking not to maintain them, continue them, or deepen them in any way. I want to sort of bring a bit of a positive note, because I think that in one sense, there are all sorts of glorious examples that I see all the time of where there are collaborations, connections that are, the learning is, if anything, more desperately needed and more appreciated on the side of the UK or the Global North organizations. And in that sense, you are getting a very, you're getting a very sort of balanced relationship, but you only get that through absolutely acknowledging that there isn't equity, that there is an imbalance, and that you recognize it. And that's not just about resources and economics and the flow of economics. It's also about history as well. So I mean, I introduced British Council by saying we're the UK's cultural relations organisation. I'm not sure that meant much to people, but key to us is the word mutuality. We see cultural relations as opposed, for example, cultural diplomacy, cultural relations as being fundamentally about looking for as equal relationship as you can find, whereas diplomacy always has some element of coercion involved in it.
We've got some more questions popping in on this thread, so I'm going to stick with this for now. So another question along the same lines is whether you see the tools and approaches created by Museum Bridge being focused on creating and building relationships with Global South, with other parts of Global North, or both. Who'd like to start with that one? Maybe Kate and Stephen. What did the research tell us?
No, go. The first thing that I think I would pull out is that the tools and approaches are not so much principally designed as either for Global North or Global South, as having in mind those institutions that already have relationships internationally and want to build on what's there, and those that are starting out from the beginning. And because the needs, that's where we find the needs as being really different. But some of the things that Stephen referenced as things that came out of the research as needs are, you know, an understanding, for example, that in some contexts, having an MOU in place is absolutely critical. And then without that, an institution can't get the necessary support in order to take work forward. So there's something about it's more important to understand that kind of cultural context in which museums are operating, and then think about what are the tools that are required, rather than whether it is global north or global south as such. And so, yeah, just to reiterate, that principal lens is there an existing relationship? Yes or no? That's really the foundation.
Mm. Thank you, Kate. I was thinking that in some ways the answer relates to the model that we described, and it being built on those sort of iterative principles of inform, facilitate, and empower. Inform, when we were talking to people, was really wide open in terms of people wanting access to information about how best to engage internationally with a massively different variety of places, and beginning in a massively different range of starting points. I guess what we felt with the model is as you become more involved and more experienced in international working, the sort of support that you need differs. So facilitated connections, or when it comes to sort of co-creation or empowerment, it probably is about drilling down into more locally or regionally focused programs. So we didn't specify what those regions or programs should be in the report. We gave lots of examples of things that are happening already, but there's a sort of natural sense in which, as you deepen the connections, it needs to become more relevant in terms of geography that connects.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Christian, did you want to add something? You look like you were about to say something.
Only insofar that when we did our last membership survey, I seem to recall that international working wasn't just about sort of global north, global south. I think the majority of our members who had responded to the survey were actually looking for relationships within Europe. So there is sort of, it's the picture is a little bit more complex, and people are looking to also work with partners in their geographic region.
Indeed. Okay, I'm going to move us along because I'm aware of time and want to make sure we cover these questions. So a further question on collaboration. I'll read this out. Building on the openness to collaboration, was there any discussion around working with private collections and supporting their international display? I'm interested in whether Museum Bridge could potentially be applied to support collections that are at risk. For example, objects identified through the ICOM red lists or collections endangered by conflict. So I might just turn to Kate and Stephen to start answering that, and then perhaps Christian picking up on red lists.
Do you want to start?
I'll start. I mean, as we reflected on earlier, the sort of ecosystem of people involved in museums is very wide and diverse. We didn't explicitly seek to speak with people from a private sector or more commercial sort of space, and it would be interesting for us to do that if the research continues, as we discussed, the sort of themes and motivations and barriers and obstacles might sort of become elaborated through those sorts of conversations. We did hear from people who had a purpose as part of their international collaboration that was more commercial. There were certainly opportunities both for private funding, but also philanthropic funding at an international level, where people would choose to invest in a particular exhibition or collaboration because they felt motivated to do so. So we didn't specifically look at international commercial collections, but the themes around the business model we touched upon in a number of different conversations.
And I would add that I think the simple answer to to that question of could the ICOM Red List be addressed through a programme like this is yes, absolutely it could. I think that so one of the themes that emerged was about care for collections, and considering care for collections, and then I think the appetite that we heard from participants to work with and through existing ICOM internationally and British Council networks and mechanisms was very apparent. So I think there's absolutely a logic there that would support work in that way.
Great, thank you. Christian, I'd give you an opportunity to add anything there. It's quite well answered.
It is, yeah, very good answer. Of course, only perhaps to add that perhaps the question indicates the kind of, you know, the breadth of the service that may be required. So, you know, while we've not specifically discussed cultural protection, it is one of the three main themes that we're working on. And you know, of course, not everything in international working is about exhibitions. There's an awful lot more to that, and cultural protection absolutely is a very important part of this.
Right, thank you. And that's a perfect segue to the next question. Thank you, Christian. So this is about wider engagement with the wider museum ecosystem. So you have talked about connecting museums. What are your thoughts on the scope for this work to think about engaging with and leveraging the wider museum ecosystem of funders, sector bodies, commercial entities, etc., for the benefit of the museums and the wider museum ecosystem, which is also important for the impact and health of the sector? Wow, great question. Steve Stenning, would you like to, I'm putting you back on the spot with that one.
Yes. Sorry, I'm not seeing the question. So
it's Ben's question. It's about midway in the Q&A now. I've been jumping around a bit.
Right. Yeah, I mean, anyway, for us, you know, to answer from a British Council point of view, then very much with this, we are looking to make those connections. That a lot of the work is about the value that museums, but also heritage, cultural protection, bring to communities, to connection with communities. But at the same time, we recognise that a lot of what drives connections is the sectors in the countries, how the infrastructure and ecosystem that supports them, and that's wide ranging and very different in very different countries. So you have to be, you have to be looking at the connections you make and how they affect, are informed by, and are part of the local cultural infrastructure, and that, you know, that's very wide ranging. I'm not sure that's a very specific answer because I still can't see the question, but hopefully the bits that I haven't answered, Christian's about to answer.
I'll do my very best. What I'm reading into this is there are sort of two strands to that. One is on the resources side, and the other one is on the networking side. And of course, you know, the cultural sector, and you know, that's the whole raison d'etre for ICOM. Of course, that networking and making connections, it's very much hardwired into everything we do, as is with the British Council as well. And on the resources side, perhaps, so, you know, of course there are an awful lot of benefits that will come from making connections, and that absolutely includes various sector bodies around the world, not just in the UK, and commercial partners. And you know, with a little wink wink nudge nudge in Ben's direction, who runs a very successful business, you know, of course we'd consider partnerships with the commercial part of the museum sector as well. You know, beyond purely financial relationships, I hasten to add as well, because there is an awful lot of experience and expertise, a lot of existing partnerships in other areas. So it's almost like, spreading out the fingers and making sure the connections are there, and absolutely using all the potential partners that are available and willing to help. And I know, especially in the museum sector, usually the suppliers on the private commercial side are often in it not just simply for the money, but also because they feel very passionate themselves about the sector. And many people who are active in commercially have a museum background themselves. So there are a lot of interrelationships existing already, and I absolutely see a role to play there for everybody. And if we're trying to create a service that is really, really varied, and it seems to grow by the day, so this is going to be a hell of a job, I think.
Christina,
Yes.
could I offer a point of a sort of clarification as well on the research? So on slide 7, where we break down the participants, it's not very helpfully labelled other. So 28% of the survey participants came from other. In fact, what that, if you dig into that, what that means is that we did engage with funders, we engaged with support organisations, often UK-based, but people like AIM, the Association of Independent Museums. We spoke to Arts Council in the UK. We spoke to various people within government. So we, and that's if we unpick other, that's what that means. So we did engage beyond individual museums or institutions, and try to speak with some of those people who are involved in building those ecosystems and those connections already. I do take it clearly that we could do more around that, particularly when it comes to those international networks. But we did speak with British Council, the regional representatives, who in part play a little bit of that sort of role already.
And sorry, Christina, just to give a slightly more specific answer, then in an area I know a little bit more about than general museum ecosystems is cultural protection, and thinking of the across 10 years of running a cultural protection fund, then there are now into the thousands of sort of collaborations. Many of them are small local community organizations that drive it, and some of them are big international foundations and organizations, but a lot are also commercial organizations in one way or another, whether they're from architects to private festivals and collections. So yeah, there is a real range of organizations we work with across the globe.
Thank you all. Very thorough answer there in the end. That's brilliant. So another question, we've got a couple more, so we'll pick those up before we finish today. How do we transition international partnerships from individual staff relationships so they survive staff turnover? Kate, Stephen, I'm going to come to you first on this one.
Yeah, so very good question, really important. It's what helps the relationship to endure in the end, isn't it? I think that this comes back to one of the slides we talked about, the importance of locating an international collaboration within an organization's vision and strategy and sense of direction. And I kind of would say this because that's my thing, but I think it is true that if you are wherever you're positioned in a museum, if you're able to locate the collaboration that you might be doing that just involves one member of staff in each institution to start with, if you can embed it within the strategic perspective of the organisation, then that will not only create a basis for connecting others within the team with that work at all different levels and across the different disciplines within a museum, but it also gives the kind of anchor for you as an institution about why you're doing that work in the first place. So that is really vital, I think, for both or all sides in a collaborative relationship to understand why they are in it. And that will help you then to navigate as well some of the challenges that will come along the way of being swayed by funding or political priorities. If you know why you're in it, then you have really solid ground to stand on. Do you want to add anything to that, Stephen?
It's a good answer. I mean, my reflection would be that outside of a small number of larger national institutions, most of the people we spoke with, they were the only international person in their organisation, or perhaps it was a part of their role. So it wasn't as if they were big teams, which adds to that vulnerability around the knowledge being sort of located individually. I guess how to counter that, clearly being networked is important. I was struck by a couple of examples of where people were building those networks at a more sort of local or regional level, where maybe a larger city-based museum was actively collaborating with smaller institutions within their own sort of locale, and through that sort of approach, pooling knowledge and resources within the people who lead on international work within those sort of dispersed organisations. There's something around building resilience by connecting locally and regionally that can perhaps help when those changes happen.
Yeah, it's always great when other people are doing your advocacy for you.
Yeah.
Sure. Okay. Brilliant. Thank you. So another one for you, Kate and Stephen. Were there any insights which surprised you, or any which have influenced the working practice or behaviours of individual members of the research team going forward?
It's a good question. I mean, a couple of sort of more personal reflections then, really. I think, as I said before, that when we did the workshops towards the end of the process that brought together really quite a diverse group of international participants, you know, people from Syria, from Nigeria, from America, from Europe, and the UK. That sense of passion that people had about wanting to build strong and resilient connections really came through. It's easy, I suppose, from our sort of Western, relatively privileged perspective, to think of this as nice to have. You know, wouldn't it be nice if museums connected together more effectively? I think what really struck me from those workshops was how this was seen as being vital to the resilience and survival and value that people sort of wanted to get from international working. It's very heartfelt. It really stayed with me, that sense of urgency and passion. The other thing I would add is a lot of my own work has been around the role of technology and the relationship between technology, arts and culture. And I guess early on I was thinking, well, you know, maybe we just need a good website. Maybe we need an updated signposting sort of place where this information can become available. And you know, let's use AI to match partners together. I think really what came through very strongly was that you need to meet people. And really, even in quite a prescriptive way, people will say, well, you need to meet twice. You know, you need to have an initial meeting, you need to have a follow-up meeting, and then you may be able to use some of those digital tools to enable the work to continue. But, you know, despite all of the focus on AI and digital, we are still humans and we want to connect with each other in person.
Thank you. Kate, any more?
Well, I think it's always good to have a reminder of how essential museums and what they're doing and the collections that they hold, how critical they are for people's sense of identity and connectedness and kind of locating ourselves in the world, in our communities. And this project really gave me a reminder of that, and in a way that was both like touching and joyful. And that came from all sorts of different directions, actually. It wasn't particular to one community or country. But the other thing that, I mean, many of you will already know this, but something that really struck me was the particular challenge, and I'm going to give a little shout out here to local authority museums in the UK, of how exquisitely tough it can be to be operating in that context, and how there are some really dedicated and passionate people who are making it work in spite of sort of manifold challenges of funding, of visibility, and how vital those institutions are in a very sort of local and connected sense, while retaining a sense of international ambition. So that's absolutely something I'll take away.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay, we've got time for just one more question, and it's a practical question in the Q&A. So the question is, would you have to be an ICOM member to use it? And when will it go live? And where will it sit between British Council and ICOM? So I think in answer to this question, Catherine, you know, these are all questions we're asking ourselves at the moment. And we've got a long way to go still in terms of our thinking about how we make Museum Bridge a reality for the sector. But what I will say, I think there's absolutely no intention that it will be limited to ICOM members. So that we want this to be an open and collaborative place for people to form partnerships, you know, not just our members. So I'll just turn to Christian and Steve and see if they want to say any more on that particular question before we conclude today.
I don't think I have anything to add to that, because those are exactly the sort of questions that we need to explore in the next few months. Where's this going? But I would agree that, you know, we'd at least got to the point that you know, whilst there were some initial thoughts, okay, is this a potential membership benefit? The whole thing goes much further than the ICOM membership. So I don't think there is any thought at the minute to have this limited to ICOM members only. I do wonder though, if you'll allow me just to make a tiny comment in response to Nusrat's question as well, about the kind of continuity of relationships. And because that question actually, and I'm wondering if Nusrat herself actually has some really interesting thoughts. That would be great to discuss that afterwards, because you've done some amazing work there in Manchester at a university museum, so not a national museum, a relatively small museum with very limited resources. And for me, actually, that question goes partly to what we're trying to achieve here. A lot of the time, international relationships are based on projects, and once the project finishes, the relationship then dies down. And I think what we're trying to do here is actually build partnerships on relationships, not just on projects. And of course, the idea is that those relationships continue at the level of both partners, and not just with individual people in an organization, and then when somebody then leaves, the whole thing falls apart. But to make it, you know, truly sustainable in the long term.
Thank you. Final word from you, Steve. Anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, just to iterate, we don't yet know what the it is in the question, and there's a great bit of research done, and that gives us, and there's been enthusiasm around it, enthusiasm from all sorts of places, and that gives us the opportunity to build something. But absolutely, there's no desire to build that purely for ICOM members, I think, and certainly not just purely for those who happen to be in contact with the British Council either, for that matter. That yeah, absolutely, to repeat the phrase again, that equitable and sustainable and long-term relationships is really what we're looking for. I mean, I know as British Council what kind of probably buys us the most leeway is the fact that we've been in most countries where we are for 80 years and a consistent, presence. So, we want to reflect that in the relationships we build going forwards. Not necessarily 80 years, but certainly sustainable.
Okay. Right, thank you. Thank you everyone for all of your questions, and I'd like to thank our speakers and our commissioners as well today. So the two Stephens, Kate also, and Christian from ICOM UK. Really appreciate that discussion. And thanks also to my colleague Anne, who's been in the background this whole time, helping to keep everything running smoothly today. But most of all, I'd like to thank everyone who's joined us today. We had attendees register from more than 35 countries across every continent of the world. And it has been an honor to share the findings of our research with you this morning. And we look forward to working together with you on the next steps for Museum Bridge. So just a reminder that if you haven't yet had a chance to read the report, please do. And it is available on the ICOM UK website. And alongside the report, you can also find our feedback form. So please do take a moment to share your feedback on the report or anything you've heard today here in this webinar by completing the form. And Anne's popping those links in the chat for you now. So that just leaves me to say thank you again to everyone for being here with us today, and wish you all a lovely and hopefully sunny weekend where you are when it comes. So goodbye for now. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.